In the yellowed records of Mercer County, there is a short, almost careless note written in pencil in the corner of a page. The final decision was made without opposition. No other details accompany the sentence, no explanation, no names highlighted. Just the silent weight of something that even decades later continues to unsettle those who read it. The case to which this note refers occurred in the winter of 1907, in a region of narrow valleys and densely wooded hills, where the cold arrived early and isolation shaped the character of families. The place appears on maps of the time only as Ridgeway Crossing, a crossing point rather than a destination. A few wooden houses, a general store, a simple church, and dirt trails connecting distant farms. This was where Samuel Whitmore lived, a 39-year-old farmer described in the census as literate property owner, married. Samuel was not known for any remarkable achievements. On the contrary, testimonies describe him as predictable, methodical, someone who rarely made decisions without weighing the consequences. That was precisely why his disappearance would cause so much unease. He lived with his wife, Eliza Whitmore, and 2 young children in a light wood house built by his own father years earlier. The residence was close to the edge of the forest, where the terrain began to rise and the main trail was lost among ancient pine trees. It was not an isolated house. There were neighbors within a half-hour walk, but neither was it part of the central core of the community. Parish records show a regular family, constant attendance at Sunday services, modest contributions to church works, no police reports. Samuel was seen as a quiet man, soft-spoken, who preferred to listen rather than give his opinion. Eliza, according to letters preserved by distant relatives, was described as practical, firm, someone who maintained the domestic routine with rigor. The atmosphere at Ridgeway Crossing was marked by an unspoken discipline. People knew when to wake up, when to bring in the animals, when to close the doors. Winter did not allow for improvisation. Wrong decisions were costly, sometimes irreversibly so. That particular year, winter arrived early. State weather reports indicate sharp drops in temperature as early as late November. The trails hardened at dawn and turned into thick mud by noon. The forest, which in summer offered shelter and resources, became a hostile maze. It is in this context that the first strange mentions appear in the documents. Nothing explicit, just small discrepancies. A delay recorded at the warehouse. A visit not noted in the church book. A side comment in a statement given months later in which a neighbor states they seemed too certain that afternoon. No one explained what exactly they were certain about. The local post office records show that Samuel received a letter 2 days before his disappearance. The sender was not recorded. The contents were never found. All that remains is the delivery confirmation, signed by him, in the firm handwriting of someone who did not expect that simple gesture to be the last official trace of his normal routine. The night before it happened, Eliza would later report that her husband spent long minutes sitting at the table, silently staring at a fixed point on the wall. He didn't seem distressed. He didn't seem nervous, just focused. When she asked if something was wrong, he replied only, "It's just a choice that needs to be made." No discussion followed, no request for advice, no attempt at explanation. What the records make clear is that the next morning Samuel made a decision, and, according to all available sources, no one tried to stop him. That's where the mystery begins, not with a scream, nor with a desperate escape, but with a silent choice recorded only in the margins of history. And that seemingly small detail is what makes this disappearance so much more disturbing than a simple unsolved case. To understand the weight of Samuel Whitmore's decision, we need to go back a few months before his disappearance, when life in Ridgeway Crossing still followed a predictable, almost mechanical rhythm dictated by the land, the weather, and unwritten rules that everyone respected. Samuel always woke up before dawn. Store records and later reports indicate that he used to leave home around 5 in the morning, even on the coldest days. He took care of the animals, checked the fences, and measured the water level of the small stream that ran through his property. He was a man of strict routine, not out of obsession, but for survival. In that territory, negligence accumulated quickly. Eliza kept the house in order with the same discipline. Breakfast was always served at the same time. The children learned early on not to stray from the visible area of the house. There was no room for improvisation or prolonged distractions. Silence was part of their upbringing. Neighbors described the Whitmore family as closed but proper. They did not attend parties other than religious holidays, did not get involved in local disputes, and were not seen in taverns. Samuel rarely spoke about himself. When he did speak, it was to discuss practical matters: harvest, weather, tool prices. However, in the months leading up to his disappearance, small deviations began to be noticed and would only be recognized as important much later when the testimonies were compared. A merchant in the central village reported that Samuel began asking unusual questions, not about prices, but about roads, less traveled trails, old passages that connected the valley to the other side of the mountain range. Years later, the merchant stated that he found this strange, but not alarming. Many men sought alternative routes in winter to avoid flooded areas. A closer neighbor, Thomas Reed, stated in his testimony that he noticed Samuel observing the forest more closely than usual. It didn't seem like fear. It seemed like calculation. Reed used a curious expression. He looked like someone measuring distance, not someone afraid. Eliza, for her part, left a brief account in a letter sent to her sister months after the incident. In it, she wrote that her husband was quieter than usual, not angry, not distant, just less willing to explain his thoughts. According to her, Samuel had always been a man of few words, but now he seemed to be hiding something he did not intend to share. There is also a report of a visit to the Whitmore's home about a week before the disappearance. The church book records the presence of a man identified only as a stranger, with no last name, coming from a neighboring county. There are no details about the conversation, only the note that he stayed less than an hour and left before nightfall. No one in the community claimed to have heard raised voices or seen any kind of conflict. On the contrary, everyone describes the encounter as too quiet to attract attention. And it is precisely this tranquility that would later become unsettling. In the days following the visit, Samuel discreetly changed his routine. He began leaving later on some mornings. On others, he returned earlier than expected. He did not justify the changes. When questioned, he replied only that he was organizing some things. The children noticed less. Eliza noticed more. In another passage of the same letter, she wrote that she felt her husband was preparing for something, but she didn't know exactly what. It wasn't an ordinary trip. It wasn't a job change. According to her, there was an air of closure, as if he were closing cycles without announcing it. The most significant detail, however, comes from a statement collected almost 10 years later, when the case had already been officially closed. A woman from the community, Margaret Hale, said she heard Samuel say in a casual conversation after the service, "Sometimes not choosing is also a choice, and it's usually the worst one." At the time, no one reacted. Phrases like this were common among men accustomed to difficult decisions. Only later, rereading the testimony, would investigators realize that this phrase did not sound like a generic reflection, but like someone who had already decided something and was just saying goodbye to the idea of going back. Daily life went on. Winter advanced. The trails became narrower, the forest denser, and despite all the small signs, no one intervened. No one asked direct questions. No one asked for explanations. Because in Ridgeway Crossing, there was an unspoken rule. Certain decisions belonged only to those who made them, and interfering with them was considered disrespectful. This rule, accepted by all, would create the perfect groundwork for what would happen next. And when the day finally arrived, everything seemed strangely normal. The day of the disappearance began without any sign of disruption. Weather records indicate overcast skies, low temperatures, and moderate winds from the north. Nothing out of the ordinary for that time of year. The kind of morning when people go about their routines without imagining that something irreversible is about to happen. Samuel woke up shortly before dawn. Eliza would later report that he dressed quietly, with calm, almost ceremonial movements. He gathered simple tools, nothing out of the ordinary, and put on a thick, worn coat. He took no weapons. He took no extra supplies. This would later be considered strange. Before leaving, he paused at the door for a few seconds. He looked at his children, still asleep. He did not touch them. He did not wake them. He just watched, as if trying to memorize a picture he knew he would never see again. Eliza noticed the pause and asked if he would be back for lunch. Samuel replied naturally, "If all goes as it should, yes." It was the last confirmed sentence he spoke inside that house. He followed the main trail for about 15 minutes to the point where the path split. One route led to the warehouse and neighboring properties. The other climbed slowly toward the dense forest, skirting the hillside. Footprints found days later would indicate that Samuel chose the second option. This trail was not off limits. It was just rarely used in winter. The terrain there was unstable due to partial thawing during the day, and visibility decreased rapidly as the vegetation closed in. Still, it was not considered dangerous for someone experienced. A woodcutter named Evan Miller claimed to have seen him around 7 in the morning. Samuel walked with a steady, unhurried pace, carrying only a cloth bag. Miller described the encounter as brief. They exchanged few words. Samuel seemed calm. He did not mention his destination. He just waved and continued on his way. From that point on, the trail began to climb more steeply. The wind made the branches creak, and the ground, covered with damp leaves, muffled their footsteps. The dominant sound was silence itself, broken only by the movement of air between the trees. Around 9 o'clock, the sky darkened more than expected. Low clouds covered the top of the mountain. There was no storm, but the light became diffuse, almost opaque. Later reports indicate that on that day, the forest seemed more closed than normal. The last concrete evidence emerges at this point. Near an old clearing, used years earlier as a resting place for animals, an object was found. Samuel's coat, carefully folded on a flat rock. It was not torn. It was not dirty. There were no signs of struggle or haste. Inside the pocket, there was only a handkerchief and a common coin of the time. No bloodstains, no signs of dragging, no obvious trail beyond that point. The most disturbing detail was the arrangement of the coat. It did not appear to have been abandoned. It appeared to have been left behind. The initial searches were confusing. The area was combed through on the same day by neighbors and later by county authorities. Footprints were found to a certain extent, but they disappeared on rocky terrain where the ground hardened and did not retain marks. There was no evidence of an accidental fall. There were no reports of large animals in the area that winter. No residents heard screams. No weapon was found. As the hours passed, the cold intensified. The possibility of Samuel still being alive diminished with each passing night. Even so, something didn't add up. Experienced men in the community said that if he had gotten lost, he would have left clear traces. If he had been injured, someone would have heard him. The silence was too absolute. The next morning, a larger search was organized. It was then that a detail, almost overlooked at first, gained importance. Near the clearing, there were faint marks on the ground, as if someone had stopped there long enough to make a decision, not to run away, but to think. None of them indicated hesitation. On the contrary, the marks suggested determination, as if, at that specific point, Samuel had chosen to follow a path that would leave no trace, and that was the last confirmed evidence of his existence. News of his disappearance spread quickly through Ridgeway Crossing, but it did not cause immediate panic. First, there was disbelief, then a heavy silence, as if the entire community was waiting for Samuel to simply reappear, walking down the trail with the same discretion with which he had left. County authorities arrived 2 days later. The official report describes the operation as appropriate to the conditions and possibilities of the region. In practice, this meant men on foot, dogs borrowed from neighboring farms, and searches limited by geography and weather. The mountains did not allow for complete coverage. There were areas that were inaccessible without real risk of death to the searchers themselves. The statements taken at that time reveal something curious. No one seemed surprised that Samuel had chosen that trail, only that he had not returned. It was as if everyone accepted the decision, but not its consequences. Eliza cooperated with all investigations. Her testimony was calm, objective, almost technical. She described her husband as someone who never took rash actions. When asked if she believed he had gotten lost, she replied simply, "He knew exactly where he was." This sentence appears underlined in the final report. In the days that followed, discreet comments began to surface, not accusations, suggestions. A neighbor mentioned that Samuel had asked about old mountain passes, routes used decades earlier to transport cattle. Another recalled that the stranger seen at the church was known for brokering poorly documented land deals. Nothing was proven. Nothing was officially linked to the case. One detail, however, caught the investigators' attention months later. While reviewing old property records, they found a silent dispute involving land near the clearing where the coat was left. Incomplete documents, unresolved inheritances, imprecise boundaries. Samuel appeared as one of the few people who knew the original landmarks of the region, established long before the official maps. This discovery raised a hypothesis that was never confirmed, that Samuel had been called in to resolve something that should not appear in public records. An informal agreement, a final settlement, something that required presence but no witnesses. The way the coat was left began to be reinterpreted in light of this possibility, not as a sign of abandonment but as closure, as if he knew that from that point on he would no longer need it. Still, no concrete evidence emerged. No body, no additional objects, no belated confession, only reports that in isolation said nothing, but which together drew a disturbing pattern of silent consent. The community reacted with restraint. There were no protests. There was no intense pressure on the authorities. After a few weeks, the searches slowed down. The case was officially classified as a disappearance with no evidence of foul play. Eliza remained in the house for another 2 years. She raised her children alone, refusing financial assistance that was not strictly necessary. She never spoke publicly about her husband. She never fueled rumors. When she left Ridgeway Crossing, she took only personal belongings and a few documents with her. None of them were ever revealed. Years later, an investigator would note in his final observations that the Whitmore case did not seem to be a mystery caused by a lack of information, but by an excess of tacit understanding among all those involved, as if everyone knew that there were things that should not be explained, only accepted, and that realization, more than any concrete clue, was what definitively closed the investigation. Decades later, Samuel Whitmore's name appears only peripherally in state archives. There is no official photograph attached to the case file. There is no death certificate, only the word absent, repeated in documents that have passed through generations without ever being updated. When historians revisit the case, they find no comfort in a clear conclusion. There are no obvious culprits, nor dramatic events capable of ending the narrative with precision. What exists is a set of small decisions, made in silence, which accumulate until they become irreversible. Ridgeway Crossing has changed over time. The main road was paved decades later. The church was renovated. The forest receded in some places. The clearing where the coat was found no longer exists in the same way. Still, the records preserve the feeling of a place that has learned to live with absences. Eliza never returned. Her children grew up in other cities, far from the mountains, far from the narrow trails. In rare interviews given many years later, one of them stated that their father was never treated as someone who disappeared, but as someone who chose to leave. The difference, though subtle, completely changes the weight of the story. For the researcher analyzing the case today, this distinction is central. Samuel's disappearance was not marked by chaos, violence, or visible rupture. It was marked by silent agreement, by a community that greatly respected the autonomy of a man accustomed to making his own decisions. The note found in the archives, "The final decision was made without opposition," now sounds less like administrative oversight and more like an involuntary summary of everything that happened. There was no resistance. There was no questioning. There was no real attempt to prevent the course of events. And perhaps that is what makes the case so disturbing, because it does not speak of the unknown of the forest. nor of invisible dangers. It speaks of the weight of choices made when no one interferes, of paths taken with full awareness, of the loneliness that accompanies definitive decisions, even when they seem correct at the moment they are made. The silence that surrounded Samuel Whitmore's disappearance was not caused by a lack of answers, but by their acceptance even before they were formulated. And it is in this silence, more than in the woods, more than in the mountains, more than in the incomplete documents, that the case remains to this day, immovable, irrevocable, closed by the last choice that no one contested.